Hey there, folks. Welcome to today's episode of the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Arthur Woods, who is the co-founder at Mathison and the author of Hiring for Diversity. Arthur, what's happening today?
Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
I'm excited for our chat. You've got such a cool experience. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your career, your path, how you got to where you are right now, and then we'll dig into some questions.
Sure. Well, for me, I started my first couple of companies in college. I had grown up in a single parent family, ended up in school, was one of the poorest kids in my class. I came out halfway through college. So it was a very interesting, world that I was in at the time. And I found myself resorting to entrepreneurship largely because I felt like I was already breaking the rules and was kind of breaking the norm, And what I really discovered was, first of all, business can be used as an agent for positive change. I think, in early age, learned that we don't just go to work because we have to work. We can go to work to make an impact. Work can be a place that we find purpose. The other thing that I found was that generally, when you're starting your own effort, the ability to be your own boss and let your values be expressed in what you're building is super powerful. So I sort of left entrepreneurship, landed at Google after graduating. I was there for a couple of years, and I got very passionate about first of all, the whole idea of how our identities are reflected in the work that we do every day. So when I was out at Google, I was in the earlier days of forming the employee resource groups at Google, helping launch our LGBTQ research group. And I had a chance to start one of the largest nonprofits called Out in Tech, which is a large community of LGBT in technology. And I became fascinated with this idea that, since we spend the majority of our lives at work, and work is not a place where everyone feels a sense of belonging, and where everyone feels a sense of purpose and self-actualization. We have an opportunity, especially through the lens of what we build from an HR tech standpoint, to think about how we sort of transform the experience for people in their jobs every day. So I had a chance to co-found a peer-to-peer coaching software company called Imperative. And as I was selling into heads of HR and learning about how much they were struggling with diversity and inclusion, this was 10 years ago, I became passionate about this idea that we could start to build a software that helps employers navigate diversity and inclusion in a whole new way. And of course, with really interesting implications for leaders who are trying to be more inclusive. So I've 3 years into now starting this company called Mathison, and we just closed a Series A, and we're a diversity, equity, inclusion tech company.
That's so cool. Well, it's interesting. So we're at 170 odd episode of the podcast, and the more and more people I talk in that sphere, and we hosted a diversity inclusion summit last year just to begin the conversations, because it wasn't our thing, as in it's not our job but it's also our job to do that. Anyways, the whole point of what I'm trying to say is it's interesting to see over the past couple months the evolution of it, much like tech has evolved over the past 20 years, how diversity inclusion is evolving. And so I suppose through the work of tech and technology enabled companies, how are people approaching not necessarily the conversation of it, but the integration of technology through their HR efforts, their diversity, and what are you seeing in that space right now?
Yes. Well, so I think, first of all, as you've seen, DEI has gone from an elective to an essential category. And we're seeing that it's no longer getting bolted on by leaders and by organizations as this kind of one-time only campaign. I think like it once maybe was 10, 15 years ago. What we're seeing, the major shift that leaders are making now is they're saying, how we approach diversity, equity, inclusion has to be pervasive in everything we create, every experience we create for our people, every experience we create in our products for our customers. And honestly, the experience we create for people we want to hire. And so our focus, in our very first chapter of Mathison has been equitable hiring. How organizations rethink how they hire inclusively, how they cast a wider net in their sourcing. Knowing that today a record number of people are leaving their jobs. They have many choices as to where they work. So companies that are taking a more equitable route are the ones that are honestly building a more diverse workforce.
Can I ask, obviously there's the software side of that, as in how you're doing it for others. But can you give me an example of how you're doing that internally, like how you're walking the walk? Because I'm really interested in that.
Yes, I'm really glad you asked that. So, we've had to turn the dial on ourselves first and foremost, because as a growing company, we have to practice what we preach. So, a few things that we've done. I mean, one, we have a assessment system that we call our equity index. It assesses 45 different parts of your whole hiring and talent processes to figure out what are you doing that's equitable and what are you doing that's not equitable. And we've gone through that index ourselves to map out where we have gaps, where we need to reduce bias. We use our own software to write job descriptions more equitably and more inclusively. We use our sourcing system to cast a wider net in our hiring. We have training that we've done internally around unconscious bias. We're doing some interesting work now in pay equity, how we ensure that we reflect salary ranges in all of our jobs, and how we look at leveling for our team to make sure that people are paid equitably. And so the great thing about this work is it's so multifaceted. It really applies to every single aspect of what we do. And we found that companies, especially growing companies, as I know that you've seen, oftentimes kick the can down the road and wait to do this work because they don't have time, or they don't feel like they have the right insights. And it only gets harder as you wait, right? So we're really big on the early stage growing company embedding DEI at the beginning of their journey, so that it's part of their DNA as they grow.
I think that's, my wife is in HR and people, and she's leading a really cool company, doing cool stuff in the video game space. And of course she's on top of that. A lot of people are on top of that, and using your software, the Equitable HR, to be able to use that as a lens. And I can see that people who want to do that will adopt it and say, hey, this is a great tool to amplify, to include these attributes into my process.
That's right. That's right. That's the hope.
Yeah. So I assert that you've got good authority now. Like, you're the person in the space. You're a person in this space. What was it like for you when you had no authority, when you kind of had to like convince people that this was a thing? And I imagine that there's still either HR managers who you don't have to sell them, but you can't sell them. They have to want to buy it. But yeah, what was it like when you're trying to like get people on board with this idea and you were facing resistance? And I ask because I assert that there are listeners who in their positions really want this, and then they have to convince their team members, their colleagues, that this is not the nice to have, it's a must have. And they're trying to like make that mind switch. Do you get kind of what I'm trying to ask?
Absolutely. I mean, I really love this question because, I think of everything on the adoption curve. So there was a moment, as not too long ago, where there were a very few number of leaders that were the active champions of DEI. And we would call it kind of in the innovator or early adopter mode. And I think part of what really happened and what was catalyzed by the events of the last few years is diversity and inclusion became something that leaders all, in many cases, sort of reflected on and said, wow, I need to become a champion of this. And it really has to be reflected in the work that I lead every day. And I think we saw it. So we've sort of seen this work, the movement kind of cross the chasm to the, early majority or late majority. And I think what we found as sort of our posture in the beginning was not trying to force something that people weren't ready to hear, but instead to have a practical and kind of helpful narrative around this is just it's just good for business. And it's not impossible. It's not saying that you have to actually take your eye off of strategic business direction to implement. It can be embedded in what we do every day. And we didn't try to lead from a position of preaching or prescribing, instead just being helpful. And we ended up writing a book this last year, partly out of this kind of just desire to say, for the leader that wants to do this work, has a lot of intent, but hasn't had a chance to really translate it to impact. What are the helpful resources and guides that we can lay out to people that they can act on immediately? And that's always been our posture, not even trying to pretend to be the foremost experts or the only experts, just to say we want to be helpful. And if you're someone who wants to make progress, I think it's totally possible. It's just about getting the right insights.
Yeah, absolutely. And so your background in education versus telling people or storytelling to communicate that makes sense to me. And one of the big challenges that I'm sure you see with people is, and just macro level, is it's hard to hire, it's hard to retain, or that's what's being said. And if we had to convince people that this is not just good, but it's good for business, but of course we're probably in our own echo chamber. If you're having problems attracting and retaining people, I would invite you to consider that there's potentially a different approach to hiring talent, and that maybe your current approach is making it hard for you to hire and attract people. So, Arthur, do you think that that is a valid statement for our listeners, no matter where they're at?
Yeah. What's the definition of insanity? It's like repeating the same action, trying to achieve different outcomes, or believing it's going to achieve a different outcome, right? I think it's the same. I mean, we are, we shouldn't pretend that if we repeat the same action, it's going to somehow yield like a different outcome, right? So when we think about kind of what needs to change, especially with our hiring, we first of all, we look at the fact that our systems have been designed in a way where they've, in many cases, been inequitable. They haven't been accessible to all communities. An underrepresented job seeker who wasn't afforded the same mentorship and support, and whose resume and job profile doesn't show up the exact same way, could be passed over or could experience a great deal of bias in the hiring process. So we have to reframe, we have to really intentionally look at every stage of the way that we operate, right? We have to reframe sort of what it really means to be underrepresented. And this, it means a lot of unlearning, frankly, in order to get to a more equitable state. And I completely agree with what you said, which is if we don't make any of these changes, if we don't have any of this reflection, we're basically going to repeat the exact same system that we've had in place to date. And it's going to likely mean that our workforce looks the same that it does today. So what I love seeing is organizations kind of boldly saying, we're going to do things differently. We're going to have we're going to reconsider those exorbitant requirements we put in a job, that actually really lessened our pool to a very homogenous group, right? That wasn't very diverse. We're going to rethink the experience we create for candidates so it's equitable and accessible. And we're also going to basically, motivate all of our team to play an active role in this work. It can't just fall on the shoulders of one or two people in our organizations anymore, like it has, right?
Yeah, what I took away from that is, well, one, it's giving more access to people. So access to new employees, more access. I think creating that pathway and looking at the systems provide more access for current employees. But I think the undertone of this, regardless of what you brand your software with, because I get it, but just to take it apart, it's a way to innovate in HR. And I hate to strip away the real value of the real why behind it. And if you're looking to innovate in HR and rethink how you're doing things, and then the obviously benefit of that is that it's helping more people and doing gooder. But that's but I also want to be mindful that I'm not like preaching about it, but let's change the tone a little bit. So Arthur, if we think of your career, you think of all the cool stuff that you've been doing, you think of the work that you're currently doing, you're doing great for people. What are a couple of moments in your career that you totally got your butt kicked and you're like, whoa, okay, that was a really great learning for me, whether that's on the path of driving this DEI, whether that's through the path of being an employer or employee leading teams, whether that's as a founder and CEO or co-founder, what are some of those things that you're like, whoa, like that was a really great lesson for me as I've evolved?
Yeah, a couple things, in my work, and I think about, I've kind of been at this sort of always at the intersection of sort of inclusion and technology, right? One of the mistakes that I've made is assuming that that everyone sort of needs the most progressive, and I would say sort of, almost, bleeding edge solution when, I think oftentimes what happens when you have someone who's in this kind of social enterprise world, who's thinking a lot about the future, right, is they're reflecting on sort of where they want the world to be in 30 years. And then they're sort of going straight there instead of realizing that like, we need to bring people forward from where they're starting, right? And sometimes that sort of bleeding edge solution isn't actually a practical, accessible system for the person that we're trying to work with, right? So I've definitely made that mistake of going way too far out and actually having ideas or solutions that are so heady and so impractical for people where they are, that it's been more about designing for the audience and the mindset of where people are today, right? So that's been one kind of key learning is sometimes being like too early or way too far ahead, and then needing to refocus on where people are. I think there's another around just this whole notion. This is just a pervasive theme that I've definitely seen, is especially in the entrepreneurial world, there's always this sense of urgency, right? And that urgency is driven by our growth targets. It's driven by it's driven by sometimes a false internal pressure that we place on ourselves, and sometimes it's an external pressure. And I think the urgency can cause us to sometimes make short-term decisions that aren't right for the long-term of our ideas. And especially when you're trying to do social change work, I think sometimes things take time, and sometimes we can't rush for the sake of an external KPI. So I've definitely made the mistake sometimes of putting a lot of pressure in terms of rushing things and pushing things to be faster, when sometimes it's just taken patience for things to set in, right?
Do you have a specific example, without throwing yourself under the bus too much, of when
Yeah,
balance that short-term versus long-term kind of mentality?
Yeah, I've been in organizations where we pressed on sales and growth so much that it actually led us to almost like be bursting at the seams, right? And it was like we were focused on growth over quality, and that it just wasn't good for anyone, and it certainly wasn't good for the movement we were trying to lead, because it wasn't as impactful as we would have liked it to be, right?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned those two things. So one is the speed of decision making, the external pressure on yourself or internal pressure on yourself, and then the previous thought was on that adoption curve. And they seem like different flavors of the same thing. It's whatever you want in your agenda, and you're saying, hey, like, let's go, versus like, hey, am I meeting someone where they're at? And that was actually, as we talked about strategic planning in the pre-call, I was going to kind of say that is, leaders are often, because they have to be, several steps ahead of their people. And sometimes they move faster than their people can catch up. So you actually have to move at the speed of the slowest person to kind of like handhold them and make sure that they can do that vision. And so I think it's cool in the context of diversity and inclusion and all that stuff. We know that there's people who are driving that forward, but we also know that there's people who are, way slower. And I think that the real progress from a society standpoint is when we can get the bottom end of it higher up, like raise the bar for everybody, versus have 4% of the world be champions and the other 96 slow behind. So I'm interested to see how that translates. Thoughts?
I love that. You bring up such a good point, which is part of the whole notion of meeting everyone where they are is being inclusive. I think there are a lot of leaders, right, who, again, and I think thought leaders do this a lot, is they do go after kind of, again, that progressive bent. And oftentimes what that means is philosophically, there are people that aren't fully on board. And I actually don't like to see this about the DEI space, when it ever feels polarizing or overly dogmatic, that a leader who might be open, but might not be fully on board, is all of a sudden turned off because they're thinking, I'm getting called out, or I'm going to get canceled, or, we have all these reasons we see leaders opting out of this work, right? And some of it is totally projected, right? So I love this idea of sort of meeting everyone where they are, helping everyone kind of make steps forward, and treating the work as though we do need everyone, because we truly do. And in fact, if we have a subset of the workforce or leaders that aren't on board, it's detrimental to all of the work we're trying to achieve together.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. Like, as you talk about it, I think of kind of the divisiveness of the world, the like, I'm Pepsi, you're Coke kind of thing. And it's the opposite of what we want. Like, we want to come to a happier medium, because it's not about me being right or you being right. Like, this is the way to go. It's saying, hey, like, how can we all learn from each other? And not to make that like kind of kumbaya, like globally, but I think that if we realize that you're going to die being right, that it's about, hey, how can we really evolve and gain from each other, that will actually be able to make that progress. I think it's tough when there is the way to do it versus a way to do it, and seeing that there's a net benefit from everybody. And that's what I really like. I was talking to somebody else on the same subject, and kind of that like balanced scorecard is like, not that you have to measure, you don't have to measure success of your business in terms of profits, but you can measure your success in terms of your business as, are you balanced? Are people having a good time? Are they safe at work? And I think it's however you decide to measure your success is your success. And it would be great if more people took that measurement on a broader level that included more of those human things. But I think, as you had mentioned when we started, it's getting there.
Well, and I think that's the exciting, that's what we're probably most excited about in the space, is that, our whole mantra is that if DEI is essential as we now believe it is, it deserves the rigor of the systems and metrics to help drive it, right? And if we think about how informal, and it's been squishy and feel goody, and which is all great, but to date, it has sometimes been the right thing for the world, and it hasn't felt like the right thing for business. So our whole mode is, let's build rigor, metrics, data into the model, so that we are measuring this and managing it as intentionally as we do other essential business functions. And then hopefully we can see the link between DEI and the bottom line, and that will make this work so much more sustainable when we can see that linkage.
Well, one of the things that just kind of clicked in my brain as you were talking about that is, from a business owner, as an employer, you say, hey, I want to hire people. I have a gap in people. What I don't think a lot of people might consider is the candidates don't give a shit about your scorecard. It's their scorecard of, hey, do I like this place? And they are the ones who really hold the power. So if there's that misalignment between what you want and what your candidate or the people working want, then it's never going to work. So the alignment really needs to be on, hey, are we measuring success the same thing? Just because I send you out a survey once every 12 months, is that really what you want as your success? And I think that if we can get that meet in the middle, like we talked about earlier, everybody will be more successful, because people will be more fulfilled. There'll be more output, and you'll have more, creativity, contribution from top down. Thoughts?
I could not agree more. And that's really the environment we want, is that everyone feels safe to contribute, feels part of this movement together. Honestly, it's where diversity of thought shines, because it's where everyone's contribution creates this collective mosaic of the community, and we're a lot stronger together. And so I think that, it's really for us where we see the linkage between diversity and inclusion, right? Which is, when we include everyone, we have much more diversity of thought. We have frankly the ability to innovate.
Cool. I love that. So one final question before I ask people where they can learn about you. How's the diversity at Coachella? Good? You having a good time?
It's great. Absolutely. And yes, I will say that, my life partner is in the music industry, and, he actually helps run a record label called 88 Rising that is focused on the Asian artist community.
Awesome.
And generally, like, the music industry in many ways has a lack of representation, especially across genres. And then the festival goer community oftentimes has a lack of diversity. So there's definitely a need even there, to see the movement take hold, right?
Yeah. You having a good time?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It hasn't started yet, but yeah.
Okay. I thought it was a couple of weeks, so I'm excited.
Oh man. No. I'm sure there have been much cooler people here earlier, but yeah.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. I took a optic glimpse of your armband, so I figured I'd ask.
Oh, yes.
Well, I think it's cool, because one of the things, especially as we move into the world, is because you can see somebody's Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, whatever, you're working with a holistic person. And I can tell from your LinkedIn profile, you're just doing awesome stuff in the community, and you're more than just a co-founder and all that stuff. So it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Where can people find out more about you? Where can they learn more about your tool? Where can they get your book and all the rest?
Yes. Okay. So folks can learn about Mathison, which is our DEI software, which helps organizations with their measurement, with reducing bias in their systems and expanding their hiring pipeline. That's at mathison.io, mathison.io. Mathison was the middle name of Alan Turing, so we named it after him. And then folks can learn about our book, Hiring for Diversity, at hiringfordiversity.com. And so definitely come and join the community.
Awesome. Thanks, Arthur. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. This was a blast.
Oh, it's awesome, man. No, I think it's really cool what you're doing. I think the more accessible that tools for diversity can be and not make it an exclusive thing. So the more inclusivity can be, the easier it'll be for people to realize, hey, it's not that daunting, not that scary, and that there's a huge ROI out of it. So I'm excited to see what Mathison does for all the communities around the world. And I appreciate you, Arthur, for being here and chatting with me today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Folks, this has been the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. I want to thank Arthur Woods, a guest today, who is the co-founder at Mathison and the author of Hiring for Diversity. Be sure to check them out. Be sure to check out their tools. And whatever you do today, just have an amazing day. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being here. And I'll see you next time.